A mother lovingly prepares a welcome home dinner for her daughter and son-in-law, a simple act of love meant to reunite their family. But the warmth of the evening is shattered when her daughter makes a stunning demand. "Your house is too cozy for my husband, and we want you to leave." What happens when a heartbroken mother refuses to go quietly? This is the story of how she used her biggest betrayal to fight back, transforming her small family drama into a global spectacle that would change everything. I always thought of my house as more than just bricks and mortar. It was a living, breathing thing filled with the history of our family. Every creak in the floorboards, every worn spot on the windowsill was a chapter of our life together. It was my sanctuary, my island in the vast ocean of grief after my beloved Sam passed away 5 years ago. I'd walk into a study, the faint scent of old books and cigar smoke still lingering in the air, tracing the spines of his favorite novels, and I'd feel his presence. This house was a legacy, a testament to the love we built. Today, I decided to do something truly special for my daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Mark. They'd moved in a few months back, and like a complete and utter fool, I thought it was a temporary arrangement until they got back on their feet. Oh, how wrong I was. So, for tonight's dinner, I'd spent the entire day like a culinary alchemist, toiling away in the kitchen to create the most perfect, classic lasagna, bolognese, Sam's favorite. Every ingredient was chosen with care. Every layer was meticulously placed. The house was now filled with the intoxicating aroma of simmering tomatoes, fresh basil, and garlic. I pulled the enormous bubbling casserole dish from the oven. The golden crust of the lasagna was perfectly browned, and a thin layer of cheese was oozing over the edges. I couldn't help but smile, feeling a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just dinner, it was a silent, powerful expression of my love for them. I set the table, lit the candles, and even uncorked a bottle of the Cabernet Sauvignon Sam had been saving for a very special occasion. Everything was ready for what I thought would be a perfect family evening. That's when they came down. Sarah, my one and only daughter, looked pale and distant, while Mark, as usual, had the air of a corporate shark who'd just stepped out of a boardroom rather than my living room. I chose to ignore the strange vibe. "Dinner's ready, my dears," I said brightly. "Come sit, I made you Sam's favorite." Mark gave a slight nod, his lips curling into a thin, almost imperceptible smirk. Lasagna, Mom. Smells great." His voice was devoid of any warmth. As I was about to serve, Mark cleared his throat. "Martha, we need to talk." The casual way he used my first name always made my teeth itch. I stopped, a serving spoon in midair. "Is something wrong, sweetie?" I asked, looking at Sarah, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. "Mark and we've been talking. It's about the house." My heart sank. Not because I was afraid, but because I lived long enough to know when a conversation was about to go south, and this one was heading for the deep end. "We love it here, Mom. We really do. It's just, it's a lot to ask of you, to share your space." My mind was already filling with a sarcastic comeback. I mean, they'd been living here for months, using my water, my electricity, my food, and my patience like it was an all-inclusive resort. But before I could get a word in, Mark stepped in, his tone cold and cutting. "The thing is, Martha, we've decided we need to live on our own. It's a matter of setting up our own life, our own home. You understand, don't you?" He said it with such condescension, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a child who was standing in her own kitchen about to serve them a meal she'd spent the day making. A bitter chuckle escaped me. "Live on your own. Mark, you've been living here for 6 months. I've been feeding you, doing your laundry, and you've been sitting on your lazy butts playing video games while I pay the bills." The look he gave me was of pure disgust. Sarah, my sweet Sarah, didn't even flinch. She just kept staring at the floor as if it held all the answers to the universe. Then she spoke. It was the moment that would forever be seared in my memory. The one that made me want to scream and laugh at the same time. Mom, we want you to move out. This house is just, it's too cozy for my husband. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Too cozy. I wanted to ask her if she was talking about a house or a damn throw pillow. My own daughter. It was so ridiculous, it was almost brilliant. My first thought, aside from utter shock, was that if anyone had told me this was going to happen, I would have said they were absolutely insane. But here we are. This is the kind of story people need to hear. The kind of thing that makes you want to shout it from the rooftops to help others see the warning signs. Maybe I should, start a little channel or something so people know they're not alone. It's a good way to stay connected. What's that thing they say? Like and subscribe, right? I tried to regain my composure. Too cozy. What in the world does that even mean, Sarah? My voice was tight, a thin wire ready to snap. Mark, the ever-helpful spokesperson, chimed in. It means we need our own space, Martha. A house that feels like ours, not a place we're just visiting. Visiting. My blood ran cold. They were treating me like a guest, an old aunt who had overstayed her welcome, in the home I built, raised my children in, and buried my husband from. I looked around my kitchen, the warm, inviting space suddenly feeling alien and cold. I saw the pictures on the fridge, Sarah's high school graduation, her wedding day, a family photo with a beaming Sam, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. All of it felt like a lifetime ago, a lifetime I had dedicated to her. And for what? For her to tell me my house was too cozy? The absurdity of the situation finally settled in, and my disbelief curdled into a sharp, bitter kind of rage. I put down the serving spoon with a clatter. Visiting? You've been visiting here for 6 months. You've been visiting my pantry, visiting my cable plan, and visiting my sanity until it's a thing of the past. And now you have the gall to tell me that my home, the place where I changed your diapers and taught you how to ride a bike, is too cozy for your husband? My voice had risen with each word, a crescendo of righteous indignation. Mark didn't flinch. He just watched me with a bored expression, as if my outburst was an expected and tiresome part of the negotiation. Mom, don't be like this, Sarah whined, her voice still thin and unconvincing. We just want a place to start our family. I laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed in the silent kitchen. Start your family? The two of you can't even start a grocery list without me. When your car broke down, who paid for it? When you got that ridiculous credit card bill you couldn't afford, who bailed you out? Me. I did. All I ever asked for in return was a little respect. I gestured wildly at the table at the untouched lasagna. I spent the entire day making this for you because I love you, Sarah. I wanted to show you I'm happy you're here. The words felt hollow as they left my mouth. Mark finally took a breath. We appreciate everything, Martha. We really do. But you have to understand we're adults now. We need to be independent. And we feel that as long as we're living under your roof, we can't truly grow. This house is a little suffocating. It's too full of your stuff, your memories, your life. He said the last word as if it were a contagious disease. I was flabbergasted. Suffocating? My home, my life was suffocating them? I wanted to grab him by the collar and shake him to ask him if he had a single clue about how the real world works, about the sacrifices parents make for their children. My stuff? My life? I repeated, my voice now dangerously low. This is a home, Mark. My home. It was built with my blood, sweat and tears, and your father's. Every stone in that fireplace, every piece of furniture, it all has a story. This isn't just a house. It's my legacy. It's a place filled with love. And you're telling me that's a bad thing? My voice broke a little at the end, the pain finally cutting through my anger. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes watery. Mom, it's not like we're just kicking you out on the street. We've been thinking about this. We want to buy a place of our own, but it's so extensive. So we thought you could just move in with Aunt Carol for a bit, and we'd help you get settled there. The house would be a great investment for us, you know? We could sell it and get our own place, or rent it out.
It's prime real estate. Think of it as a loan from you to us. The casualness of her suggestion was breathtaking. A loan? From a house that belonged to me? It was the most audacious, self-serving, and cruel thing I had ever heard. I wasn't just a mother to her, I was a bank account, a means to an end. It was no longer just about them wanting a place of their own. It was about them wanting my house. The house I built with Sam. The house that was the only physical thing I had left of him. And they weren't even asking for it. They were demanding it, as if it was their birthright. I looked at my daughter, the beautiful girl I had poured my entire life into, and for the first time, I didn't recognize her. The warm, bubbly child I remembered was gone, replaced by a cold stranger with the calculating eyes of her husband. They had come here under the pretense of needing help, and now they were trying to take everything I had. They had no shame, no guilt, no sense of obligation to the woman who had given them everything. I felt a fire ignite deep in my stomach, a stubborn, unyielding flame of resolve. I had been a grieving widow for too long. I had been too kind, too accommodating. But this was different. This was a war. And it wasn't over a house. It was a battle for my dignity, for my legacy, for the memory of the man I loved. They had made a terrible mistake. They had underestimated me. The last thing they saw before I turned my heel and walked away was the uneaten lasagna, cold and solidifying on the counter, a perfect metaphor for their hearts. What happened next would change everything. You won't want to miss how this mother stood up to her own children and exposed the truth they were hiding.
The next morning, the silence in the house was a thick, oppressive blanket. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with the echoes of their cruel words. I woke up with the kind of headache that felt like a tiny carpenter was building an extension in my skull. I dragged myself out of bed, the events of last night replaying in my mind like a horrible B-movie that wouldn't end. Too cozy, she had said. The sheer audacity of it still made my blood boil. It was a phrase so devoid of warmth, so surgically precise in its cruelty, that it could have only been delivered by a person who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional detachment. It was almost professional. I walked into the kitchen, and there it was, the lasagna. Still sitting on the counter, a testament to my misplaced affection. It was cold, congealed, and as unappetizing as the situation itself. It looked like a tombstone for my former relationship with my daughter. The whole thing was just so surreal. I mean, my child, my own flesh and blood, was sitting a few feet away, probably still asleep in the bed I paid for. And a few hours ago, she had asked me to leave my home for her convenience. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter in my throat. It wasn't just sadness. It was a profound sense of betrayal. I threw the entire pan into the trash, not bothering to scrape the remains into a separate container. It deserved no respect. It was a symbol of a love that was no longer reciprocated. It was a waste of perfectly good basil. As the heavy pan landed with a clang at the bottom of the trash bin, a new thought solidified in my mind. The old me, the grieving widow, the doting mother, was gone. She was buried under the cold, cheesy ruins of that lasagna. In her place was something else, something sharper, more resilient, a woman who was tired of being stepped on. Just then, Mark sauntered into the kitchen, looking as though he hadn't a care in the world. He grabbed a mug from the cupboard and poured himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. He just existed in my space, taking what he wanted as if I were a piece of furniture he had decided to tolerate. The sheer insolence of his presence was a physical weight.
I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could stand there, so calm, so entitled. "Good morning," I said, my voice dripping with as much poison as I could muster. He didn't even look up. "Morning, Martha," he grunted, a tone reserved for people he deemed beneath him. My sarcasm and biting wit, which I had once considered my secret weapons, were utterly useless against a person who simply refused to acknowledge my existence as a human being with feelings. It was like trying to argue with a brick wall made of pure arrogance. Then Sarah came in, still in her pajamas, looking as though she had slept like a baby. "Mom, Mark and I were talking, and we really think this is for the best. For everyone. You'll be so much happier with Aunt Carol. You guys can spend all day knitting and gossiping." I stared at her dumbfounded. Knitting and gossiping? Was that what she thought of me? Was that what she thought of my life? A relic to be put in storage with her old childhood toys? It was an insult so profound it almost stole my breath. I had always supported Sarah. She'd always been a bit flighty, I suppose you could say. After college, she had moved from job to job, from city to city, never quite finding her footing. I never judged her, always told her it was part of her journey. When she met Mark, a man who seemed to have a 5-year plan for everything, from his retirement fund to his morning coffee, I had been relieved. I thought he would give her the stability she needed. Instead, he had given her a blueprint for cold, calculated self-interest. He hadn't changed her for the better. He had simply revealed a part of her I never knew existed. "For the best?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with contained fury. Sarah's face crumpled slightly, but the tears didn't come. It was a practiced expression, the same one she used when she wanted to get out of a chore as a teenager. "Mom, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. We're not kicking you out. We're just making new arrangements." New arrangements. The corporate doublespeak was a direct import from her husband. She had always been a terrible liar, but now she was a natural. It was a skill he had clearly taught her. I felt like I was losing my mind, caught in some twisted reality show where the participants had no empathy, only goals. The conversation devolved into a full-blown war of words. Sarah, fortified by her husband's quiet confidence and her own sense of self-righteousness, began to list my supposed flaws. My house was too cluttered. My way of life was too old-fashioned. My presence was an obstacle to their personal and professional growth. Every accusation was like a small knife twisted in a wound that was already gaping open. They had no idea what they were doing. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was the point. I looked at Mark, and for the first time I saw him not as Sarah's husband, but as the architect of my misery. His eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of any genuine emotion. He was simply waiting for the inevitable outcome. He was so sure of himself, so sure that I would fold, that I would pack up my things and quietly go live with my sister, who, by the way, was dealing with a sick husband and had no room for me, but that was just a minor detail in their grand plan. "You've lived a good life, Mom," Sarah said, as if giving me a parting gift. "It's time for us to live ours. You wouldn't want to stand in the way of our happiness, would you?" It was a question, but it was also a threat. The ultimate emotional blackmail. The implication was clear. If I didn't comply, I would be the villain. I would be the one who had selfishly denied her children their chance at a bright future. A strange calm descended over me. The fury, the pain, the shock, all of it just evaporated. In its place was an icy clarity. They had planned this. Every casual mention of needing more space, every subtle complaint about my unnecessary belongings, it had all been leading up to this moment. They weren't just taking my house, they were trying to steal my dignity, my autonomy, my very sense of self. They were trying to rewrite my history, to erase me from the very place where I had created a lifetime of memories. But I wasn't an obstacle, I was a force of nature. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. I had survived the grief of losing the love of my life. I had built a home and a life from nothing. I had raised a daughter who, for a time, I thought was a decent person. I wasn't going to let them win, not like this. I walked over to the dining room table where Sam's expensive wine still stood uncorked. I picked up a glass, poured myself a generous amount, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I watched them, these two strangers who were trying to dismantle my life. They were so young, so full of themselves, so certain that the world owed them everything. They hadn't experienced real loss, real betrayal. They had no idea what was coming. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, my eyes fixed on theirs. "You're going to live your own life, but you're not going to live it in this house." I set the glass down with a definitive clink. Their smug expressions faltered for a split second, a flicker of surprise in their eyes. They hadn't expected defiance. They had expected an old woman, broken and defeated. They were in for a rude awakening. I was no longer a mother. I was an adversary. The game had changed, and I was just getting started. The fight was on, and they had no idea who they had just picked a fight with.
The silent treatment is a weapon of the petty. It's a form of emotional terrorism, a passive-aggressive act designed to make you feel like you're invisible and insane at the same time. After my little speech about taking back control of my life, a new kind of war began in my house. It wasn't a loud one filled with shouting and slammed doors. It was a cold war, conducted in whispers and calculated silences. The atmosphere in the house became so thick with their disapproval that I felt like I was breathing in liquid. They didn't speak to me, only to each other, and they made sure I could hear every word. "Did you see where Mom put the remote? I can't find it anywhere," Sarah would say to Mark, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. Mark would then reply, "Maybe we should just get a new one, less cluttered." I heard it all. Their comments were like little jabs with a needle, designed to sting, to remind me that they were still here and they were still winning. It was a game of emotional chicken, and they were playing for keeps. They had decided that if they couldn't get me to move out with logic, or what they considered logic, they'd simply make my life so miserable I'd beg for a different address. The first few days were a blur of petty annoyances. They would leave their dirty dishes in the sink, knowing I couldn't stand a messy kitchen. They would leave a trail of their shoes and clothes up the stairs, forcing me to navigate a minefield of their personal belongings. My favorite chair, the one by the fireplace where I did my crossword puzzles, was now permanently occupied by Mark, who would stare at his phone with a condescending smirk on his face, as if he knew exactly what he was doing to me. It was all so childish. I had to remind myself that these were two grown adults, my daughter and her husband, who were actively trying to make their mother's life a living hell because they wanted her furniture. I wanted to laugh, but the absurdity of it all was too painful. But then, things got worse. The small acts of aggression escalated into something more deliberate, more malicious. I had a collection of antique teacups from my grandmother. They were delicate, hand-painted things, each one with a story. My grandmother gave them to me when I was just a little girl, and I treasured them. They were a link to my past, a quiet reminder of a woman who had taught me what it meant to be strong and independent. I had them displayed in a special cabinet in the dining room.
I came downstairs one morning to find one of the prettiest ones, the one with the gold rim and tiny bluebirds, lying shattered on the floor. The shards looked like broken bits of a dream. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't have been an accident. The teacup was in the middle of the room, far from the cabinet. It was as if someone had taken it out, walked over to the center of the room, and deliberately dropped it. I felt a cold wave of shock wash over me. It wasn't just a teacup. It was a piece of my history, a piece of my heart, and they had broken it. I knew it was them. I didn't have a shred of proof, but I knew it in my bones. It was a message. They were telling me that if I didn't leave, they would systematically destroy everything that mattered to me. I clenched my fists so tightly, my nails dug into my palms. The passive-aggressive tactics had graduated to outright psychological warfare. They were no longer just making me feel unwelcome. They were attacking my memories, my most cherished possessions, trying to erase me piece by piece. My home, this house that I had built with love, was turning into a battlefield, and I was standing on a pile of broken porcelain. I went back to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed, the pieces of the teacup still flashing behind my eyelids. I was a 59-year-old woman, and I was being terrorized by my own daughter and son-in-law. It was a thought so absurd, it almost made me laugh. Almost. The truth was, I felt a deep, chilling fear. What would they do next? What would they accidentally break, or forget, or lose? It was a game, and I had no idea what the rules were, or what the prize was, other than my dignity. When they came back that evening, I decided to confront them. I had to. I had to let them know I wasn't just going to sit there and let them walk all over me. I stood in the middle of the living room, waiting for them, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles were white. When they finally entered the room, looking tired and self-satisfied, I didn't waste any time. "One of my teacups is broken," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Sarah's eyes darted to Mark. He, of course, had an immediate answer ready. "Oh, that old thing? It was an accident. I was just passing by and must have bumped the cabinet." His tone was so casual, so dismissive, as if he were talking about a piece of trash. I wanted to scream. "The cabinet isn't near the middle of the room, Mark. The teacup was broken on the floor. It looks like it was thrown." He scoffed. "Now you're accusing us of doing it on purpose? Honestly, Martha, you're becoming a little unhinged. You're letting the stress of this living situation get to you." Gaslighting. I knew that word. My younger friends had talked about it. It was a nasty little tool for making people question their own sanity. He was trying to make me think I was crazy, that I was imagining things. And Sarah, my own daughter, said nothing. She just stood there, her hands shoved in the pockets of her jeans, a silent partner in crime. That's when it hit me. They weren't just trying to get me to move. They were trying to break me, to dismantle my sense of self so completely that I wouldn't have the will to fight back. They were attacking the very foundation of my life, the physical symbols of my love and my history. They had turned my safe place into a hostile territory. The teacup, the cold lasagna, the constant whispers. It was all designed to isolate me, to make me feel alone. And for a moment, I did. I felt utterly alone, standing in the middle of my own home with two people who hated me, two people who I had once loved more than life itself. The anger and the fear were replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I couldn't beat them at their game. Their brand of passive-aggressive manipulation was a language I didn't want to learn. I needed a new plan, a plan that was bigger, bolder, and more public than anything they could have ever imagined. I needed to fight fire with fire. But my fire would be much brighter. I walked past them, not giving them the satisfaction of another word. I could feel their eyes on my back. They thought they had won this round, but they had no idea. The game was far from over. I was tired of being the victim, tired of fighting on their terms. I was going to change the rules. And the answer, I think, is something they will never see coming. It's a part of my story I am terrified, but also a little excited to share with you. The next morning, I woke up with a plan, a ridiculous, terrifying, and utterly brilliant plan. It was so simple, so completely out of their corporate-minded playbook that I knew they would never see it coming. I wasn't going to fight their petty, passive-aggressive battles anymore. I wasn't going to get drawn into their mind games. I was going to use their own tools against them. All those podcasts Sarah and Mark listened to about personal branding and leveraging digital platforms and monetizing your story, I was going to beat them at their own game. It was a new kind of war, and I was going to fight it on my own terms. My first order of business was to reclaim my space. I walked down to the kitchen, and for the first time in weeks, I ignored the mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. I didn't say a word. I simply made my coffee, poured it into a fresh mug, and carried it with me as I walked out the back door and into the garden. My garden was my sanctuary. It was where I felt closest to Sam. He had built the beautiful stone paths and the trellises for my climbing roses. I spent hours there, tending to the flowers and vegetables, feeling the earth between my fingers. But for the past few weeks, I hadn't been out there. I had been too consumed by the war being waged inside my home. As I sat there, sipping my coffee, I heard them arguing. The words were muffled, but I could make out Sarah's exasperated tone. "I don't understand, Mark. Why isn't she saying anything?" she whined. Mark's voice, as always, was cold and condescending. "She's trying to get a reaction out of us, honey. It's a new strategy. Just ignore her." They were so predictable. They thought every move I made was a calculated part of some master plan. They had no idea that my master plan was just beginning. My next move was to get my life back on track. I started with a call to my friend, Brenda. Brenda was a force of nature, a retired librarian with a mind like a steel trap and a mouth that could out-sarcasm anyone. She was the only person I knew who wouldn't just listen to my story. She'd help me plot my revenge. "Brenda," I said, my voice low, "are you busy? I have a proposition for you." I told her everything. The lasagna, the teacup, the too cozy comment. She was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and full of a cold, steady fury that I knew well. "Martha, get your laptop. It's time to go viral." The first video was the hardest. Brenda and I set up my laptop in the dining room, the very room where Sarah and Mark had told me to leave. The camera was pointed at me, and I felt a tremor of fear. I had no idea what I was doing. Brenda, however, was a natural. She had researched everything, from lighting to hashtags. "Just be you, Martha," she said. "Tell your story. The world needs to hear this." I took a deep breath and began to speak. I started with the lasagna. I talked about how I had made it with love and how it had been left to rot on the counter, a physical embodiment of my daughter's betrayal. I talked about the teacup, the one with the little bluebirds, and how it was a symbol of my grandmother's love, now shattered on my floor. I talked about the too cozy comment and how it was the most absurd, heartbreaking, and frankly, hilarious thing I had ever heard. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. My voice was calm and steady, but the emotion was there just under the surface. It was a confession, a eulogy for a relationship that was already dead. I ended the video with a simple message. This is my home, this is my story, and I'm not going anywhere. We uploaded the video, and for a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the comments started to trickle in. OMG, this is my life. I can't believe your daughter would do this, wrote another. This is so relatable, wrote a third. Within an hour, the trickle had become a flood. By the end of the day, my little video had been viewed thousands of times. My phone, which had been silent for weeks, started to buzz with notifications. The internet had found my story, and they were outraged on my behalf. When Sarah and Mark came home that evening, they didn't know what had happened. They were still wrapped in their cold, silent bubble of resentment. They didn't see me sitting on the sofa, scrolling through comments on my laptop, a small smile on my face. They didn't know that my little video had gone viral and that the world was now watching them. My little act of rebellion had become a global phenomenon. And the best part? The best part was that I was just getting started. I had more videos planned, more stories to tell. They had tried to silence me, to make me small and invisible. They had no idea that I had just found my voice. The climax of my story was about to unfold, and they were the unwitting stars of the show. The whole world was watching my story unfold. What they did next, when they found out what I did, will leave you speechless. The morning after I posted the video, the house was eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, there were no passive-aggressive comments, no loud sighs, and no dirty dishes left in the sink. It was as if they had both evaporated into thin air. I walked into the kitchen, made my coffee, and sat down at the table, scrolling through the comments on my laptop. The video had exploded overnight. It had been shared thousands of times, and the comments were pouring in, a tidal wave of support and outrage. I had gone from being a grieving widow to a viral sensation. I was in the middle of reading a comment from a woman in Ohio who had a similar story with her own son when Sarah came storming into the kitchen. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide with a mix of shock and fury. She was holding her phone, which was showing my video. "What is this, Mom?" she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "What the fuck is this?" I looked at her calmly, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. "It's my story, sweetheart," I said, my voice as sweet as honey. "The one you said was too suffocating for you." She looked at me, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. You put our business on the internet? Are you crazy?" "Everyone is calling me a monster, a terrible daughter." She was practically spitting fire, and I felt a pang of satisfaction. My plan was working. I had exposed her, and now she was facing the wrath of the internet. Mark came in right behind her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Martha," he said, his voice dangerously low, "take that video down, now." I looked him straight in the eye, my smile widening. "No," I said, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "This is my story, Mark, and I'm going to tell it all. The broken teacup, the too cozy comment, all of it." Their faces went white. They knew I was serious. They had underestimated me. They thought I was a helpless old woman who would be easily broken. They had no idea that I was a force of nature and that I was about to unleash a storm. The next few days were a living hell. They tried everything to get me to take the video down. They screamed at me, they cried, they begged. Sarah even tried to play the victim, telling me that I was ruining her reputation and her life. But I didn't budge. I was a rock. The more they fought, the more resolved I became.
I had finally found my voice, and I wasn't going to let them silence me. Then, something happened that I never saw coming. The video had reached millions of people, and one of them was a reporter from a major news network. She called me and asked for an interview. I agreed immediately. I was going to tell my story on a national level. I was going to expose them to the whole world. I was going to get my justice. On the day of the interview, Sarah and Mark tried to stop me. They stood in front of the door, blocking my way. "Mom, please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this. We're your family." I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the little girl I had once known. But then I saw the cold, calculating eyes of her husband behind her, and the image shattered. "You lost the right to call me family when you tried to take my home," I said, my voice filled with a cold, steady fury. I pushed past them and walked out the door. The interview was a success. I told my story with honesty and dignity, and the world listened. Within hours, my story was everywhere. The comments were pouring in, and they were all on my side. Sarah and Mark had become villains, and I had become a hero. They had tried to break me, but instead they had made me stronger. They had tried to silence me, but instead they had given me a voice. I had lost a daughter, but I had gained a family of millions. I had lost a home, but I had gained a platform to help others. The war was over, and I had won. In the end, Sarah and Mark moved out. They didn't sell the house. They left it in my name. They had no choice. The public pressure was too much for them. They had tried to take my home, but instead, they had lost everything. They had tried to break me, but instead, they had made me stronger. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And my story had just begun.